Hello, political scientists. Welcome to the next lesson. My apologies on Monday that I left you without any videos, but I hope that the task made sense and I hope that you understood its relevance. By now, you know the big three that the textbook has decreed you need to know about. And I say the textbook, I really mean the exam specification. What we're going to be moving on to then is a little bit more in depth about where these thinkers took socialism, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the UK. For reasons that will become rapidly apparent, doing the whole of socialism would take an incredible amount of time, and the textbook and the exam spec both seem to focus mainly on the UK, and they both seem to focus on the development of socialism in the UK until about the time of New Labour. The main reason for this is under Corbyn it was still under flux, and of course under Keir Starmer we still don't quite know what direction he's going to be taking things in, and so understanding the development of socialism in the modern era beyond Giddens is going to be difficult at best, and possibly even impossible at worst. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to introduce you to a series of quotes. There are two here. For reasons I don't fully understand. There I am. So the first quote is taken, and you might have heard this quoted quite a bit. Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. And certainly that is one way of looking at socialism, one way that people around you may be quite used to, and you might have heard before. That gospel of envy has been parodied into the politics of envy. Socialism is very good at telling people how to spend their money. I think is the US version of the same thing. However, there is another way of looking at it. There is but one mode by which man can possess in perpetuity all the happiness which his nature is capable of enjoying. That is, by the union and cooperation of all for the benefit of each. Union and cooperation in war obviously increase the power of the individual 1,000-fold. Is there the shadow of a reason why they should not produce equal effects in peace? Why the principle of cooperation should not give to men the same superior powers and advantages, and much greater, in the creation, preservation, distribution, and enjoyment of wealth? And what you have here are the two different ways of looking at socialism. You've got a positive and you've got a negative. And also what you've got here, quite interestingly, is the way in which socialism often trips itself up. The second quote, the positive, is 2 paragraphs long. There's a lot to unpack in there. The first quote is far punchier, far easier to understand. It's that appeal to emotion that I was talking about when we last, when you last observed me give a video lesson on conservatism before the half term. And there's something to be said for the punchiness and the easy messaging of that appeal to emotion compared to the very cold, rational, and complicated explanations that socialism provides. And if you've done your reading and you've done your research, you know that this is one of the problems. You've looked at these people. These are very rational people, rational in a way that Ayn Rand just isn't. Ayn Rand believes herself to be rational. There's another quote about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. Reading those as a teenager, one of them will leave you isolated socially, awkward, without any real friends, and the other one is about orcs. So sorry, that's awfully mean to Ayn Rand, or not, I don't know. Anyway, the point is, I'm going to talk you through socialism in a bit more depth, and today's lesson is all about early socialism. Why? Well, the textbook doesn't really go into it till later on when it's talking about issues in socialism, when suddenly this comes into being in sharp relief. And if you've looked at it in the textbook, and why wouldn't you, then you kind of know where I'm going with this. If you haven't, don't worry about it. The thing to bear in mind is that socialism is often seen as a reaction to capitalism. That is, the capitalism is based on the understanding that economic endeavour creates capital, excess wealth, and the politics defining where that moves and how it's created and where it goes is called capitalism. It's not just an economic theory. Socialism is often seen as a reaction to that, and there's a good reason for this, but the roots of socialism actually go back further than the roots of capitalism. Indeed, capitalism and socialism kind of grew out of the same melting pot. Primitive socialism, based on anthropology and study of the past, is actually one of the more recent ones to be added to the pantheon, because we didn't really understand certainly prehistory in the way we understand it now. But the more we understand about prehistory, the more we understand that primitive socialism isn't what you think it is. Karl Marx, when he created his 5 stages of history, about which we won't really go into too much depth here, read the Communist Manifesto if you're interested. It's available for free online. Do read it. It includes the 5 stages of history there. Karl Marx talks about primitive socialism, in which he argues human beings lived in a resource-scarce environment. There wasn't enough to go around. And so to combat that, you had to share everything in common. And in order to do that, you had to enact a form of socialism. Marx's argument was that that was not sustainable. The resource scarcity, that the lack of things, meant that eventually you had to change how you were doing things. And the original understanding of what happened to prehistory to move us into an agricultural method of living where we lived in one place and didn't move around, we weren't nomadic, we didn't hunt, we didn't follow our food, implied that there wasn't enough to go around and we had to adapt in order to make our lives more comfortable. Increasingly, studies have shown that that's not actually the case. The first agricultural societies were actually less healthy than the nomadic brethren. Something was going on here. Furthermore, the evidence seems to indicate that for much of human history, we were in a resource-rich environment. There was more than we required. And yet, early human society appears to have been collective. They were very tightly knit, they were very close quartered, and what they did collectively. A good example would be Stonehenge and the movement of large stones, which if you come from Sri Lanka or Madagascar, where these are still things that they do, require collective endeavour. The whole point of moving the large stones wasn't the monument at the end, and that is interesting because we don't really know what the monuments are about. But the process of getting the stones to their positions, that was part of the point, and it can only be done collectively. So an archaeologist from Madagascar, on arrival to Salisbury and seeing Stonehenge for the first time, instantly clicked what was going on and said, well, obviously this was done with great feasting. Obviously this was a communal endeavour. There was no one person in charge. There were no priest caste. This is what we do in Madagascar, he said. And this shone a light on how prehistoric societies may have functioned. If you're collective societies with collective endeavour, with shared resources, well, then you are living socialism. Now that changed. We know that changed. Something terrible happened and forced human beings to start farming and be less healthy and less able to, well, collectively do things. The next time we rejoin it is the Levellers, not the pop group, in the, or Diggers, in the British Civil War. Initially, they supported Cromwell, and they did so because they saw that monarchical power was not a good idea. They decided that that was separating mankind from its collective endeavours and preventing man from living in equality. Note the man use here, it's not just scientific, I'm not talking about humankind, I'm very specifically saying man here. Early socialism of this kind was invariably paternalistic, though intriguingly, there's always an undercurrent of feminism within it, and we will come back to feminism. They wanted self-governing communities. They were mainly puritanical, they were mainly organised by religion, but what they wanted was some kind of independence from the state to run their own affairs. Modern day theorists might refer to them as anarchic, but the idea of being collective and living in a collective whole with everything shared in common makes them more socialist. And in that sense, they're definitely before what we would term as capitalism. This idea of socialism definitely exists and was thought of as such. The land and the fruits of the land were to be distributed equally and fairly. And it's that second word that's important in that one. Equally doesn't mean an absolute equality with everyone getting exactly the same. They get what they need, which is different. At first they were ridiculed. The piss was taken liberally. Apologies for the swear word. But this didn't work, and then they were actively and violently suppressed. They came up with the idea, and they didn't express it thus. Proudhon will steal it later, as property being theft. All property is theft, and that's why you've got to be careful when you have people round and you offer them a cup of tea. I would recommend fruit teas. It's why anarchists don't drink tea, because all property Is there? Sorry. Then we move to the French Revolution, 1789, and we've already talked about the French Revolution. We mentioned that when we were mentioning liberalism. I've got Fourier, and I think this is Babeuf. Gracchus Babeuf wrote the Manifesto of Equals, and he argued for a less liberal interpretation of what the French Revolution was about and how man should live in brotherhood, fraternité. And he argued that everyone should be equal on some level. Now, the equality he uses is equality of opportunity, as well as a foundational equality, a fundamental equality that comes from being born, the natural rights of John Locke. But he takes it a stage further and argues that the state was necessary to make sure that people had the same equality of opportunity, and that they should have the safety net should they fall beyond that. So it's kind of like welfare liberalism, but from a completely different angle. It's from building from the ground up rather than starting from a liberal idea that you're free from the state and then building downwards. This was an idea that the state itself was intrinsic in allowing human beings to be free in the first place. It was built on by Charles Fourier, who had a utopian idea of what socialism was. He argued that you needed independent communities of around about 2,000 people. Any bigger than that, and it would be impossible to know everyone in your community, impossible to be in tune. Whereas any smaller than that, and you simply couldn't carry out the kind of economic activity required to live at the technological level in which he was writing around about the French Revolution. He argued that production should be communal. There shouldn't be mass production. People should see a product from start to finish and invest, as they had done since time immemorial, their worth in what they were able to produce. It meant something. You were tied to your labor. That's why you had to have around about 2,000 people. Now, he said, by all means have mills, by all means have factories. But the difference is, they called them manufactories. The difference is that the human would follow the material rather than one to the next in a production line and you'd be unskilled labor. The idea was you'd learn all the different parts of the labor and then you could fit in wherever you fit best. Goods, therefore, will be shared because there'd be no appreciable difference between those that produce them and those that use them. And decisions could be collective. Again, the limiting of the size to make it effective. He argued for a direct democratic method and something called consensus politics. The idea that you wouldn't get everybody agreeing unanimously, but a consensus would develop where people would assume certain things about their society and adapt accordingly. So it wouldn't just be a group of individuals, Ayn Rand, nor would it be a group of individuals working toward the common good, liberalism. It would be a society of individuals who would have individual characteristics but would recognize the power of the collective whole at the same time. Weirdly, Fourier argued for a breakdown of marriage and family. Because you didn't need those things. The community would replace family. Marriage would be about ownership. And if you don't believe him, consider what's said in a marriage ceremony. The role of the father is to give away the bride. Consider that language for a moment and consider the idea that the parents of the bride are expected to pay for the wedding. That's fascinating too. It's based on an idea of a dowry, the idea that the wife, the woman, would be a burden to a new husband, economically and socially, and therefore the parents of the bride would pay to have that burden taken away from them and taken on by a new family. It's another reason why women wear white. It's the commodification, the making of her virtue, something you can buy and sell. It's an advertisement of her virtue, commodification of virginity. And that in itself is fascinating. Brides that were not virgins were considered less worthy or worth less than brides that weren't. So it makes sense for Charles Fourier to say that marriage is not a properly humanistic and positive institution. It's a form of ownership. And there's nothing in human biology, he argued, to say that humans have one life partner who they stay tied to. So without the need for a family to raise children, because you've got this community of 2,000 people that adapt and work in a society and as a collective whole, it takes a village to raise a child. Thank you, African proverb. you don't necessarily need marriage either. So goes the theory. He accepted that his ideas were utopian, that you'd never fully achieve everything you set out to do. There would always be problems. But it was a goal at which to aim. It was a windmill at which to tilt, if you like your Don Quixote reference. Robert Owen, that's this fellow over here, was a British utopian. And he took Fourier's ideas and tried to set it up in the Americas. He literally founded communities of around about 2,000 people and tried to make it happen. I put in brackets, no free love. Robert Owen didn't go for the idea of breaking down the institution of marriage. He was much too Christian for that, and argued that Christianity was the foundation stone of socialism. Now bear with me here. British socialism is very different to continental socialism. Continental socialism is very anti-clerical. The power of the church on the continent in Europe was so powerful that a lot of socialism was about breaking that institution's power. In the United Kingdom, it's very, very different in a way that we don't see in other socialist traditions. British socialism can get enormously Christian, and that is odd. You don't find many Christian socialists or socialist Christians outside the UK. It's a very, very odd, mainly UK thing. Look up C.S. Lewis if you don't believe me. Robert Owen went further, and he argued that the importance of education was vital and that all humans should be educated. And a lot of early capitalists believed the same too. If you can teach a worker to read and write, then training is cheaper and your worker becomes more effective. And you can put signs on machines warning them about things, which saves you having to replace workers that get damaged or wounded because they're not reading the signs. Furthermore, Robert Owen believed in the power of environment. And by environment, I mean where you are brought up, your parentage, your surrounding area will have an effect on how you think and how you feel and how you adapt. And the more you can augment that environment with helpful things, the better the output at the other end. You have to compensate for environment. Some people will arrive from an environment like your good selves, with the ability to read and be widely read. You guys come from a background where your parents are likely encouragers of literacy, and you probably come from a household that has books, and you understand that books are a thing. I'm living at the moment in Ilkeston, and the story that Mr. McNamara will tell, ask him about it, is when he first moved to the area, he asked someone in Ilkeston, they'd set up a bookshop, why they shut, because they had to fold. And the bookshop owner said that they'd been open a couple of months when somebody came in and ordered 2 feet of books. Could they be read, please? Basically, they're buying books as a sort of fashion statement to match their decor. And at that moment, the bookshop owner realised there was little point for a bookshop in Ilkeston, and so shut down. And there's something to be said for that. I live here, that there are no bookshops, there are charity shops, and the kind of books they carry are what we call trash novels. People here aren't as educated, for want of a better phrase, and the environment, therefore, that they raise their children in means they don't have the same literary background that you guys do. And as a consequence, the exam results are different, that there's a power in environment. And Robert Owen spotted this. Now, bear in mind, this is in the late 1700s. This is before you end up with the first real capitalist revolutions. So, yeah, this is around about the same time. The last form I want to talk about is utopianism. Now, it was called such in a critical way. It was criticised for being utopian. Do I have an image? No. The ideology has been claimed to be based on wishful thinking. If wishes were fishes, we'd all be swimmers. I can't remember how that works. But the idea was that socialism was impractical. Talk to your parents about it and you might get the answer, oh, it's a very good idea, but it would never work. All it takes is for one selfish person, and that sort of thing. And this criticism of socialism as being wishful thinking and a nice idea, but kind of stuck. It implied that the goals are unrealistic and that anything else, any less cynical view of human nature, is simply deception. However, my argument is that there are other reasons for failure of socialism, and that socialism isn't necessarily utopian. Make of that what you will. You don't have to agree. Remember, you guys are more left-wing than I am, which is still terrifying. So you probably have a much better handle on this than I do. So why did early socialism fail? My argument is that because it predates capitalism, or not just my argument, the argument in many studies of socialism as well, it was an alternative to early capitalism. And as a consequence, it didn't really critique early capitalism. There was no need to. You look at what Arkwright was doing at Cromford, for example, just up the road from Ecclesbourne, and you see that, generally speaking, it was a positive thing. People moved there of their own accord, and they expected to be paid well, and they expected to have comfortable living quarters, far better than was available in the agricultural societies from which they hailed. And yeah, capitalism looked good for everybody. Sure, Arkwright was the one making the incredible amounts of money, but his workers were also more comfortable, better looked after, and valued. And so you could argue that capitalism was more attractive than socialism, and therefore the liberals of the day kind of gravitated toward capitalism than they did to socialism. Also bear in mind that this early form of socialism didn't really have a name. It was an offshoot of academic thought. As a consequence, capitalism actually has a name, and things with a name are easier to define and easier to understand. And for that reason, they're not going to criticize capitalism. In fact, many early socialists argued that capitalism was good. So there was really no point in following socialism or having a go at capitalism. And as a consequence, capitalism kind of won the day. Furthermore, this is early socialism. There were no evils yet. Capitalism wasn't fully developed. The inequalities inherent in the system hadn't come to fruition yet. People hadn't realized what those inequalities actually meant in practice. For the most part, things looked very positive. As I was explaining, for the workers and for the factory owners, everybody seemed to get something out of capitalism. Capitalism promised great things. Indeed, there was unclear social conflict, if any. And if you know anything about socialism and anything about communism or Marxism, then you know that class systems are incredibly important in that. If you can't see any social conflict, and yet you're trying to base your ideas on trying to minimize social conflict, then it's really hard to sell. You're trying to solve a problem that isn't a problem yet. In fact, many early socialists weren't seen as revolutionaries, they were seen as reactionaries. They were seen as trying to put the genie back in the bottle of early capitalism and industrialization. They were opposed to mass production, and as a consequence, those that ran the factories, those that were making money from the factories, and the workers themselves viewed that with, well, a bit of fear, actually, and a bit of worry. They were more Luddites and swing rioters than they were any kind of visionaries looking at a future. They were almost backward looking. They wanted to end technology, it appeared. It has seemed like it was a romantic ideal opposed to progress. And that was the map I was thinking of, by the way, down the bottom here, that I couldn't see earlier with the animation. I apologize. It's the map of utopia, a non-existent state that is wishful thinking. So that's one of the reasons it failed. For our purposes then, and for the rest of this part of the course, we're going to be talking about types of socialism. We're going to be talking about revolutionary socialism, and that's Marx and co. You did Friedrich Engels, and you did a bit of Rosa Luxemburg, all of them weirdly German. And they argued that capitalism was naturally unequal. You can't fix capitalism. Capitalism is, by definition, something that gets in the way, and it's going to create and exacerbate, make worse any kind of inequality in the system. They argued that the only way to fix it was to replace and abolish capitalism. Capitalism could not be reformed. Capitalism could not be changed. It had to be abolished, it had to be removed, it had to be replaced. Capitalism would not go willingly, and as a consequence, it's revolutionary in method. It requires violence to remove the entrenched concepts of capital and power. The early form of this was based in something called dialectics. This is a form of philosophy where you take an idea, a thesis, and a thesis, an idea, creates its own opposite, the opposite idea, or the antithesis, antithesis. So you've got the thesis and the antithesis. They fight because obviously there's a contradiction. That contradiction creates conflict. The conflict creates a compromise to end that conflict, and that compromise is the coming together of two ideas, a synthesis, like a synergy of ideas, synthesis. That synthesis is a new thesis, creates an antithesis, and so on and so forth. And the guy that came up with this, a philosopher, was a German called Hegel, and he argued, therefore, that human society would be constantly changing. Karl Marx, what was he, was the first to take Hegelian philosophy, the dialectics, and apply it to the world you could see, touch, taste, and feel, the material world. And thus, his system is called dialectical materialism. You take dialectics, thesis, antithesis, creating a compromise, synthesis, and you apply that to the way of the world. You apply it to history. Karl Marx applied it to the history that he'd seen so far and argued that we're in the third epoch at the time of his writing of human history. More on this later, I suppose, and therefore postulated two further epochs and then an end of history, a synthesis that created no antithesis. That was his contribution. Each epoch of history would have to be moved on by revolutionary action, two of which would be violent. One had happened in the past. He postulated the English Civil War, by the way, and the French Revolution. And the second one was in the future, and that would be the communist revolution. It wouldn't lead initially to communism, it would lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat, but eventually it would lead to communism. So that's Karl Marx. In the UK, the next step were what we call democratic socialists. Now, democratic socialists and social democracy are big on the continent, that they are a huge deal. The difference with the UK with democratic socialism is mainly Webb, Beatrice Webb, is that it had that Christian flavour. It had that idea of a very British way of doing things. I'll explain in a moment. Basically, the idea was to extend the voting and the franchise to the working class. Then it was to set up socialist parties who would then advance socialist policies. These would be a trained, superior cadre of politicians and economics and university professors and so on and so forth. There'd be an educated elite that would understand how society worked. There was a distrust that the working classes could do it for themselves, like sisters, or rather unlike sisters, who I believe can do it for themselves. The idea here was that you could take a capitalist system and you could modify that capitalist system to work for the betterment of everybody involved in it, rather than just the rich. But to do that, you needed people at the top to tell the workers what to do, because the workers wouldn't necessarily understand. You have this paternalistic approach. And that is peculiarly British. And it's based on the idea of learning from others and having people trained for those higher functions. If you want an extreme version to understand, you might have studied 1984 by George Orwell, in which he took this to the illogical extreme, where you had the party workers and the proles. And that's essentially what democratic socialism was based upon, but as I say, taken to an illogical extreme. The next form is social democracy. And that is where you have consensus politics and where you have an agreement between the parties in power that the workers have to be looked after, and therefore the whole of society has to work together. You might recognize this from the ideas of one nation conservatism on that map that you're working towards. Anthony Crosland is our poster boy here, and he shaped Labour, the Labour Party, from the 1950s and 60s and beyond. Most of 20th century Labour could be argued to be socially democratic. And their argument was you take capitalism and you reform it so it supports everybody in the capitalist system. So not just modify it, but literally take it, shape it, make it work. Almost Daft Punk there. Take it, shape it, move it, make it. As their basis, they take Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was an economist who was the only one who spotted that going to the gold standard in 1925 was a bad idea. And as a consequence, when it was a bad idea and it went wrong, everyone turned to him and went, "Ooh, you figured that one out in advance. We must listen to you." And he argued that the state, if it took some control of the economy, sort of the planning nature of it, rather than leaving things to short-termism and trying to get as much profit as possible in a short space of time as possible, the state could try and plan and set goals, and therefore you could create something called full employment. There would be no need for anyone not to have a paid job. And eventually, he argued, there would be a need to reduce the amount of working hours because we would make machines that would mean we wouldn't need the whole population involved in the production of things. So whilst everyone would have work, there'd be full employment, not everyone would work all of the time. There'd be an increase in leisure time. And this was quite a powerful thing in the 1920s and 30s. And what 20th century Labour tried to do was take these Keynesian ideas of state control and state lead of the economy, with private and mixed economies in that, and try to create that shining future of leisure. Intrinsic within this, as a baseline, as a fundamental foundation from which to build, you need a welfare state. And the welfare state had to be wholly state-owned, and it had to be open to everybody. That way, anybody in need will be able to use it. And this includes things like the National Health Service. It includes things like unemployment benefits. It includes things like national insurance, all of which, happily, were already there in the UK system. The final type of socialism that we're going to be using, there are plenty, by the way, these are just the ones in the textbook, is the third way. From here on in, I'll refer to it as Rev, Dem, Soc, and Third. The third way was Giddens, Anthony Giddens, yes, another Anthony, and the New Labour experiment of the 1990s. Beyond that point, beyond around about 2015, it gets really difficult to chart socialism in the UK and to say whether or not the Corbyn experiment was moved back to social democracy or democratic socialism. And it's quite hard. There is a slight difference, but as you can see when we go on further, it's really difficult to drive that wedge between them. So what is the third way? The third way is a creation of equality of opportunity through education. Education being an absolutely intrinsic part of this idea of environment being deliberately created by the state. However, when it comes to economics, when it comes to organizing the economy, there was a belief that the free market and the invisible hand of the market would do better than any kind of state system. Now, sure, a government and a state could provide a guiding hand, and they could help root out things that were destined for failure. But ultimately, private economies and privatization was the way forward. The more private control of the economy took hold, the better your economy would be. It would be more flexible, it would be more effective, it would do its job better. For that matter, the welfare state was becoming unwieldy and difficult. It was not necessary to have universal welfare support. Rather, you had to means test it. Some people didn't need it. And those that didn't need it but got it anyway would end up being dependent upon it and would be unable to take part in the economic life of the nation. And so Anthony Giddens argued you needed really to try and encourage people off benefits. You needed to get them back into work. That idea that you might run out of work that was around with Keynesian economics had disappeared. There was now a belief that work was its own reward and that there were going to be unemployed people. And that inequality was pretty much baked in, and that some people were dishonest. And at this point, you might be reasonably questioning, is the third way socialism really socialism? Well, you might not be. I'll explain why in a moment that can come into consideration. Just leave it there with a question mark. Does this count as socialism? Now, in the textbook, they say it does, and in the exam specification, they argue that it's a form of revisionism. Previously, when I used to teach this course, I called it revisionist socialism. But those were in the days before Blair had left the scene. So make of that what you will. But yeah, I'll leave that as a question mark. For the purpose of the exam, it totally is. It's just a nice question to have in the back of your minds. Oh yeah, there we go. I have to make that work. I have to also get rid of my face. The next thing you need to be aware of is social class. The 19th century, 1800s, socialism is obsessed with the concept of class in a way that our society isn't as much anymore. And yet class still has a massive, massive effect. Class conflict was the main thing. Different classes had different aims, different needs, and different methods to get what they want. Consider ourselves as middle-class people and consider how we approach things compared to people who are working class. And you kind of know what I'm referring to there. So middle-class people tend to think of themselves as deserving of certain things, whereas and entitled, and will apply that entitlement to working class people. Working class people, by contrast, will argue that they are not entitled to certain things. And when they get something for nothing, if you like, they will defend that because they don't feel they're entitled to it. Gaming of the system in education is actually much more of a middle class thing than it is a working class thing. You are far more likely to find middle class parents who try and get their children assigned a label, for want of a better phrase, and I realise that is dismissive, to get them an advantage in exams, whereas working class families of children with, or working class parents of children with severe difficulties like dyslexia or autism, and who have difficulty accessing exams are far less likely to seek out help because you work at these things and it's just what you do, whereas a middle class family are more entitled. My point being, there are class differences. I'm getting in the weeds. The class system, by the way, is split into three, and I always liken it to a Victoria sponge cake. Your bottom sponge is your working class. The cream and jam are the upper working class, the managerial class. You'll notice I've not included them on my list. The upper sponge is your middle class, and then the smattering of icing sugar on top to make it a good Victoria sponge cake is your upper class, giving you rough ideas and rough indications of the numbers involved in each of these classes. How do we work out what class you are? Well, it's based on your relationship to the means of production. The working classes make the means of production work, whatever they may be. The middle classes tend to own the means of production, and the upper classes tend to be wealthy through means other than those associated with the means of production. Some basic assumptions of socialism and where we go from here. Socialism, when it comes to human nature, is unique. It's the only one that looks at human nature and essentially says human nature is good. Their idea of the state of nature was actually a positive one. The state of nature, that time before politics where human beings operated, was actually a time where human beings recognized common humanity, recognized their collective nature, and worked with one another rather than against one another for the common good. And the reason for this was resource scarcity, or at least the recognition that one had to share, because if one tried to hoard things, other people would die, and then you eventually would die from that. So they argued that the environment creates consciousness. If you want to understand who a person is and how they operate, you look at where they come from and you look at how they've operated. And by where they come from, I mean in a more than just a physical sense. I'm meaning in an intellectual sense as well. Education and society play a huge role in developing the adult, in developing the full human. Furthermore, a basic assumption is that workers create wealth. In fact, do I have a diagram on this? As my environment creates consciousness, I forgot to pull up. Workers create wealth. I think I do. There it is. Yeah, there it is. So you might recall this diagram that I showed you earlier in the course when we're talking about different political parties. The bit at the bottom, those three boxes, are the benefits of civilization. 2/3 of the benefits of civilization go to the top half, 1/3 of the benefits of civilization goes to the bottom half. Broad brush strokes. It's not an exact science. And you see the definitions here from socialism. And again, from the definitions of these different classes, you understand a little bit about how socialists see them, because the way they talk about them. At the top, The ones who take part of that 2/3 are tramps, beggars, society people, aristocracy, landowners, and those with hereditary wealth. Yes, hereditary wealth people are exactly the same drain on society as tramps and beggars. Natch. Below that, you've got exploiters of labour, thieves, swindlers, pickpockets, burglars, bishops, financiers, capitalists, shareholders, and ministers of religion. You see where we're going with this. Those who get, then there's a big thick line dividing the wasters, as it were, with, sorry, the wasters on that side, with the workers, the creators of wealth. You've got those engaged in unnecessary work. Many people would argue that's me. And all those engaged in necessary work, those who produce the benefits of civilization, like authors, artists, farmers, factory workers. They create the benefits of civilization. Unnecessary work are people, I guess, like, I don't know, stock marketeers and such. No, wait, not stock marketeers. The people that run it. Not, you know what I mean. It'll come to me later, probably after I finish this video. Workers create the wealth, other people get the wealth. This is a basic tenet of socialism, and they argue that's exploitation. Socialism is all about reducing that exploitation and using it to create a society in which it doesn't take place. They're also big on the idea of equality and freedom, but so are liberals. So what's the difference? Liberals argued freedom from, and socialists argue freedom to. You are not properly free unless you can turn down work. Otherwise, you're a wage slave. You work because you have to. You cannot remove your labour. Now, that's an interesting thing. They also talk about social justice, the redistribution of the benefits of society and civilization so that it's more fair. And that's a key thing here, the idea of fairness, which brings us to the idea of social justice. Social justice will look a lot like baseless attacks to those who have got a better standing in the society than it will to those who have a lower standing in society. So to the richer people, mainly the middle class, social justice looks an awful lot like being terribly unfair to them. Collectivism, working together, human beings work better together. Now, if I'd done this in the classroom, one of my ways, and I'm quite proud of this way, of talking about socialism would be to get you to build a tower out of Lego or some kind of wooden blocks, and just give you that, the highest tower wins. And eventually, some of you would have twigged that working together to build a tower in the 5 minutes allotted would allow you to build a much higher tower and thus share the rewards, whatever they may be. And thus I proved to you that collectivism works better than individualism because those who work together get higher than those who don't, and therefore win. So collectivism, and that's how I'd argue it. It's a silly thing, I know, but it makes a point. Alas, now I've just given the game away, so I can't even do it next year. They also believed in the abolition of private property, and people always deliberately misunderstand this, and it continues to frustrate me because I'm a very precise person. Property is land. It's things that produces an income. It is not possessions. My phone is not my property, it is my possession. I own this. But socialism doesn't argue that I need to get rid of this. It argues that I need to get rid of my house, or rather the ownership of my house. I'd still have a house, I'd still have somewhere to live, but the ownership of my house would not be mine. It would not be mine alone as it currently stands. Hopefully, that's provided a useful introduction. What we're going to do next is this. Oh, I've broken it. I've got to fix the animations. And I'll tackle this next week, because I think this video is almost an hour long now, and I think that's more than enough to be getting along with, because you'll have to keep pausing to take notes and to drop comments in the show my homework section of things you don't understand or things you want further input on. So what I'm going to do is, and this should have been 2 videos, and I apologize, I kind of got carried away there, I don't know if you noticed. I will leave this as a single video, about an hour in length. Hopefully it's been useful to you to explain where socialism is coming from. I'll talk about their core values, which is the first bit in the textbook, next week. And I'll also put something in there on the divisions within socialism, the issues that follow on from that, which is the next part of the textbook. And then we'll have finished. You'll notice in the textbook, they talk about what I've just talked about in the divisions within socialism, which makes sense. But I thought it was more useful to have that at the beginning before we talk about what their values are and how they are defined, so that when you come on to those issues, you know what you're talking about and you know where these things come from. They're just operating in a vacuum. Anyway, nearly an hour. I shall bring this to a close. Thank you if you have been for watching. Have a lovely day, Year 12. And who knows, we may see each other face to face sooner or later. Schools are supposed to be opening from the 15th of June as I create this video. No doubt that'll be changed by the time you see it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you then. We'll be able to discuss things and come with questions, and you'll have plenty. From all of this, I'm hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have pretty much polished off ideologies. The big three, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, will have finished very soon. I'm hoping to tackle feminism and nationalism as a bonus by the end of the year, because that just gives us more that you can pick from in an exam. You don't have to know more than one other ideology, but I figure knowing two would make things easier for you. So, have a lovely day, Year 12. I'm sorry to have gabbled a bit. I'm hoping it was useful. Do let me know if anything is unclear. And I shall see you, or rather you shall see me, next week when I talk about the core values of socialism. Thank you very much.